So we're in an environment of a machine shop. You were like building your own. You had your own milling. Your own.
I could make almost all the parts, and of course my daddy would help me in sophisticated stuff. And I remember the homemade tractors. I would put a transmission behind, and I used to have to make a drive link between, and you'd have to mill the splines and so on. And I finally got so I could do it quite well. But this was all practical and learning it.
So you actually, not from a book, you learned by actually seeing it work.
Actually showing it. In other words, well, first of all, I had to figure out the number of splines and so on and draw it all out. And then I had to set up the lathe to do that. And my dad helped me initially. And then, of course, I could do it on my own quite well. That's been tremendous all through my life, because if you look around here, I've got just everything. I've got my own machine shop down. I can make anything still today, and making my prototypes over the years. It's just been tremendous, because a lot of the equipment we make is fairly precise. And if you have another machinist make it, and you give him in this way, and he ad-libs and changes it, you'll think, well, geez, your idea wasn't good. And that happened to me 2 or 3 times. Ad-libbing is the worst thing you can do for an inventor. That's some of the prototype shops. You know, they won't make it exactly like, and you figure, well, your idea wasn't good. And then years later, you find out, well, so somebody else discovered it was.
So you learned the fundamentals that it does take some math and
mathematics was always like set back on your bends and stuff like that. Oh yes, this was one thing my daddy always did. He made me apply, and that way you remembered. And especially in mathematics that you would use general and algebra and so on. But physics, absolutely. When something worked, here's the principle behind it, or the joint principle. He really helped me on that. And he made physics dynamic. In other words, he would take and give me, take an equation in physics and reduce it to English and so on, and explain it to me that way, and then put the equation together. And from what I learned there, that had helped me no end in medicine, teaching physics, because all the medical respirators I build are all based upon a mathematical and physical base.
Now, when going into, did you go through high school? What schools did you go through to high school?
We had what we call Mass Ed, which started, I guess it started about 1935. But essentially, that would pay tuitions and so on. And that was helpful as far as my family was concerned. And my dad being in the National Guard, I guess there was about 25 kids, I guess, and 35, I guess, and signed up. And what would happen, they'd pick you up actually as a sophomore, but by the time it came along, I had passed that. And it was before 35, probably 33. It was during the Depression it started. Well, anyhow, the last 2 years of my high school, we were still attached to the high school. I remember going to the Brockton Armory, and they taught physics, mechanical drawing. It was great all the way through. In other words, the technical stuff in Brockton. So I had 2 years of that. As I say, each day I'd go to the Brockton Armory, and we went, I think it was 10 months of schooling, something like that, and we had pretty stiff hours. And so anyhow, I went there, and then what happened was, when we were supposed to go on to our colleges that they selected actually for him, and it was all contract. In other words, my daddy always figured the military was paying for the government. In Boston, it was called Massachusetts Education, and it was the only class they ever had. But actually, what happened was, we got there and we found there was things that Massachusetts State had, like civics and so on, that we hadn't received. So we had to go back to our high school and get those, which were a few months. And I learned teaching in some of the kids. That was the first teaching I ever done, and I thought it was great. And I graduated from high school in June of 1935. And from my Stoughton High School. In fact, Pam and I were just back in Boston a year or so ago, and they have a basic unit Hall of Fame, Stoughton High School. So I got my 1935 certificate in the Hall of Fame back there. Yeah.
Now, during your youth in high school and your educational, those early years, what did you do for entertainment? Did you go to the movies or listen to radio?
No, my entertainment, I was always busy. Rarely did I ever go to the movie. We had a radio. I remember WEEI in Boston. My dad used to listen to Walter Winchell on the weekend. Of course, he was a talk fasting guy, all the ships at sea and so on. And then Lowell Thomas every night. And Amos and Andy he liked. And sometimes he'd keep me up on the news. And we had a Boston paper, I think I forget which was. The local paper was only once a week in those days. But I was always busy. I had my chores, I really did. Homework was very, very easy for me. Very easy. And of course, a lot of that I think was help at home. And I think that really helps any student today.
Did you have a best friend in those days?
I really didn't. I really didn't.
Did you have childhood heroes that you looked up to in those days?
You know, it was kind of interesting. Probably I should have looked up to Mr. Ford. And the oldest Ford dealer in the world was Jim Lehan in Stoughton, Massachusetts. And Mr. Ford used to come out every Labor Day for I don't know how many years, but anyhow, I was young. I was probably 12 or so at that time. And he would come out, and I'd been making the Model T Ford tractors. And of course, in 27, 28, times were good, and all the farmers bought these Fordson tractors. And I had built this. But anyhow, Mr. Lehan was a good friend of my daddy. And Mr. Ford would come out, as I say, over Labor Day. And my dad had clam bakes on the 4th of July and also on Labor Day. And Mr. Lehan used to bring me probably 3 or 4 years in a row. And, you know, I admired him, obviously, for what he did. But aviation was in my mind even at that time. That was great. So that's how I met Mr. Ford. And then later on, my daddy, of course, had soloed me in 1935. And in 1937, my dad had to go out to Endicott, New York, because there was a customer he had for shoes. So he took me to Elmira up there and got me a glider ride, and they towed it with a car at the time on the way. And then he didn't tell me at that time, but when we got through, he said, well, we're not going home yet. And we went to the Cleveland Air Races that year. He timed it just so. And while I was there, he introduced me to Earl Wright. Well, he was God to me. You know, I read all about what they had done and so on, and I in detail. And well, I should have felt the same way with Mr. Ford, but you know, it was a little different conception, I guess.
So Orville Wright, then.
Yes, he lived, I don't know, 1982, if I remember, quite a while. And of course, his brother died of typhoid fever quite young, as you may know.
Now, you had this love of aviation, but you also had love of cars. Do you remember the first time you started driving cars?
Yes. In other words, to begin with, I had a motorcycle, one lung, a Harley. And I think it was a Harley 61, probably made about 1928. And of course, I was too young to get a license at that time. And then finally, I took and built a real nice Model A Ford power plant. And I swapped it for almost a new at the time, Chrysler Straight 8. And Royal 8, they call it. It was a beautiful car. It was convertible, in fact. It had very, very low mileage. And so that was a good swap. And then I got that car. That was the first car I had, but I couldn't legally drive it on the highway. And my daddy took and made sure I was checked out. And then he got an exemption, said, well, look, I'm on a farm and so on. And I got the exemption and I could drive, but within limits. And I remember at that time, Blue Sunoco fuel was 10 for $1. In fact, that's what we used in the OX5 engine, and we used it there, and so the car used the same. But the car did use quite a bit of fuel. And my daddy read in Popular Mechanics or something where you could get this kit, and you start the car on gasoline, and then you run it on kerosene. And what it amounted to, you had copper piping, you wrapped it around. Now, if it vapor locked, you had too much. Well, he got that kit, and I played with it for a while, and it worked well. And kerosene was probably 4 or 5 cents a gallon at that time. So these are the things that I did coming up, and my daddy was always there helping me. Yeah.
Family holidays, did you guys do holidays?
Holidays.
Celebrations?
We did. In other words, we go swimming together with the pond and so on there and stuff like that. But we had everything we really wanted. We didn't travel that much. But we had my daddy. Well, there was 2 places we went, and this is when I was a little older. And my daddy had a place, he had an uncle that died down on Duxbury, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. And we used to go down there. My dad had a sailboat, a catboat, and I remember I used to do the woodwork with him, you know, chinking and so on. Every few years my mom would take care of the sails. And we would go down there, and that was probably our recreation. And you know, we would really go out. And what happens, we would take and go out when the swordfish and so on would come up through there. And I remember one time we were way out, way out beyond land. And we got a monstrous swordfish out there. I guess they call them blue marlin or something. I don't know what they call them. But anyway, my dad had a cavalry pistol he always got. So he shot it, and we tied it to the side of the boat and brought it in. And I'll tell you, the whole town was eating swordfish for quite a while. But we used to go down there, and there was lobster traps down there I used to take and get lobster and so on like that. So there, and then also up in Marlow, New Hampshire. My dad, I don't know exactly how he came into it, but there was a maple syrup from there. I think there was 5,000 maple trees or something like that up there, and blueberries. And we would go up there. I'd get out of school, and when it started to thaw, and you drill a hole in the maple tree, and you had a little spigot, and you drive it in, and it had a I think it was about 2.5 gallon kind of a red white bucket that we used to have on there. And I remember doing the buckets, and we do, and also they had a horse drawn with, I don't know, probably held 200 gallons or something. You'd pour it into that. And then the sugar trays were massive copper deals, and the roof was kind of open on it. You'd burn wood, and you'd put that in, and you'd try it down. Of course, you'd vaporize it and bring it down, and then you could make maple sugar, whatever you wanted. But the interesting thing, while I was that age where I painted the buckets on, Dutch boy white lead paint. That's what we used to paint the maple syrup, so I guess it didn't hurt any of us all the way through. So that was kind of the recreation. Yeah.